This is video 3.2, and the goal of this video is to be able to graph a quadratic, a parabola, using the intercepts and the vertex. So in this video you'll learn a shortcut to graph, but here's one thing I want you to remember. You can always make a table to graph a quadratic if you get stuck on a test. You can always make a table. It just takes longer, and sometimes you won't find the key points that are important to answering questions about a quadratic. So remember, you can always make a table, but you're going to learn some quick ways to find the key points of a quadratic, which is also known as a parabola, in the following video. So here's the first parabola that you're going to look at graphing. Y equals x squared minus 5x plus 6. Remember, we know this will make a parabola because of the fact that it has an x squared in it. It will not be a straight line. It'll be that U-shaped parabola, or perhaps an upside down U. So let's talk about how to find those key points and what we know about parabolas from all the ones we've graphed using tables. This parabola can have either two x-intercepts, one x-intercept, or zero x-intercepts. So that's really important. So I'll draw you a couple quick sketches here. You could either have the parabola that has two x-intercepts, so we have them here and here, or perhaps the parabola has only one. We call this a bounce. It's going to just drop right there and just barely touch the x-axis. It could also have zero, so that could be a parabola that looks like this. This parabola does not go up to the x-axis, or maybe it's above. But there are three different cases. Either they're going to have 2, 1, or 0 x-intercepts. So we're always going to test for those first. It will always have one y-intercept. That's a fact. It will always have one y-intercept. So we will always be able to graph the y-intercept. The other thing that we're going to use is the vertex. The vertex will help us find a key point in the graph that will help us answer some real-life questions about parabolas that describe real-life things. Finally, we're going to use the symmetry of the graph. Okay, the graph comes down, remember, and then it repeats itself, and it goes right back up. So there are these points that are on opposite sides that are at the same level. And we're going to use that symmetry to help us graph the fourth or fifth point, depending on the situation. So let's take a look at this situation. Let's start to find these things, and then we'll summarize these steps that we're doing. Okay, so x-intercepts. So we've talked a lot about these in class. X-intercepts, remember, it's when y equals 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my rule and I'm going to put 0 where y is, and I'm going to solve for the answers for x. So I see 0 for y, and I think about, how do I solve this problem? What tools do I have? And the tools that you have are factoring, to use the zero product property, or quadratic formula. Now, quadratic formula is awesome, but sometimes quadratic formula is more work, right? You're noticing that when you're calculating that in class lately. So I'm going to try factoring because these numbers look pretty small. So I'm going to try and factor this into a pair of parentheses to figure out when it's 0. So this will require me to draw a generic rectangle, a diamond problem, and then I'm going to fill in my numbers that I have. Let's see. So I have x squared and 6. So that means my product has to be 6x squared, and my sum is negative 5x. Multiplies to 6, but adds to negative 5. So that means my answers must both be negative. And it looks like negative 3x and negative 2x will work. Negative 3x, negative 2x. And then I start to fill in the L sign. X minus 2 and x minus 3. So my factors are x minus 2 and x minus 3. So I have my factored form, but how does that help me? Remember, that helps me because if something times something equals 0, so the 0 here, then one of those has to be 0. So remember, we break it apart at this point and we ask the questions, when are these two factors 0? And we solve, and we see that this one gives me an answer of 2. Maybe you saw that earlier. And this one gives me an answer of 3. So that means I have 2 x-intercepts because I got 2 answers. So my x-intercepts are 2 and 3. So on my graph, I'm going to go over to 2, and I'm going to go over to 3. And those are my two x-intercepts. So I have 2 points. I'm now going to move on to the next point that I'm going to find. I'm going to find the y-intercept. This one's going to be a lot easier. So I'm going to find the y-intercept by plugging in 0. 0 is going to get plugged in now for x, excuse me. Because when it's a y-intercept, now that means that x will be 0. So I'm going to plug in 0 for x. So into my rule, I'm going to have 0 squared minus 5 times 0 plus 6, which will give me 0 minus 0 plus 6. So my y-intercept is 6. This one's pretty easy to find. So now I'm going to find 6 on my graph, and I'm going to mark a point. So that's a y-intercept at 6. So notice I have 3 points right now. Okay, 3 points on my graph. The next thing I'm going to find is my vertex. My vertex is very important that you know about symmetry in order to find the vertex. Okay, the vertex is always going to fall in the middle of the graph. So we think about, remember, the vertex is that lowest point, and sometimes it's the highest point on the parabola. So the vertex, in our case, is always going to be in the middle. So I want to make sure I find the middle, but look at what I have. I have 2 points that are in the same level. So I need to find the middle of that, because in between those 2 points is the vertex. So the vertex is always in the middle of your x-intercepts. So once you find those 2 intercepts, you can find the vertex. So the vertex must be right in the middle. So we think, what number is in between 2 and 3? Well, 2.5. Okay, if you're not sure about that, if the numbers are bigger and it's hard to tell, we simply are going to add the 2 numbers and divide by 2. That's an averaging, and that will give me 2.5. That's finding the middle of 2 numbers when we take the average of them. Add them up and divide by 2. So 2.5 is my middle, and once again, I'm going to plug in that number. I'm going to plug this in for x, and I'm going to see what y has to be. So y equals 2.5 squared minus 5 times 2.5 plus 6. So punching that into my calculator, since there's so many decimals here, when I punch that into my calculator, I get negative 0.25. That's the y value at my vertex. So my vertex is the point that's at 2.5, comma, negative 0.25. So remember, we got the 2.5 because it's in the middle of my x-intercepts, and the negative 0.25 by plugging in that number. So now I have that point. Oh, it's kind of going to be hard to graph, but I can make an estimate of it. Let's see here. It's going to be just below the axis, and it's just a little bit negative. It's going to be right in there somewhere. So we start to see our U-shape form. Do you see it? But the question is, I want something over here. I want something that I can sketch in over here. Okay, so if I want something that I can sketch in over here, I'm going to use the symmetry. So this is going to be really nice and helpful if you can see the balance of the graph. It's not entirely necessary, but it's really nice. So notice how this 2 is 2 away from my y-axis. Okay? If I go 2 away from the 3, it's going to be at the same level. So I'm going to go 2 away to the 5, skipping 4, just like we skipped 1 over here, and I'm going to go up to 6. That's using the symmetry to finish your graph. So the graph will go like this, because it has to be balanced. So that 6 here has to be 6 over here, the same distance on the other side. So I use the balance. Now that 6 kind of tricky to do, but you can always plug in a point. If you didn't know how to do that, you can always plug in 4 or 5 over here, and that would help you find the rule as well. So this graph, yes, it still takes some work to graph, but once you get the hang of it, it'll go pretty fast, much faster than punching it into your calculator and making a table of values. So let's take a look at one more example, and we'll summarize the steps that we took. So we're going to graph the parabola, and we're going to record the steps. So remember, our first step is to find the x-intercept, where y equals 0. So I'm going to put 0 in for y, and I'm going to figure out what x has to be. So remember, your 2 options here are factoring or quadratic formula. So let's see, if I factor, I'm going to start with my box, fill in what I know. And I know my diamond problem, it has to add to negative 6x. And then the product is 8x squared. So adds to negative 6 multiplies to 8. Well, I know they're both negative, because a negative times a negative is a positive. And it looks like negative 4x, negative 2x. So fill that in here. Okay? Pause the video here and see if you can fill in the outside of this box real quick. I'm going to do it while you're waiting. So did you get the same outside as me? Maybe you didn't, but the good news is you will still get the same zeros. So continue on with me in writing your product. Continue on with me in writing your product, even if yours looks a little different, because the process will be the same and you will get the same answers. And remember, this is equal to 0. So now we break it up. Even if yours looks different, break it up with me now. Set them each equal to 0, and then solve. And see if you get the same answers. I'm going to get 1, and let's see, this one's a little bit trickier because of the 4 there. I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I'm going to divide by 2. Divide by 4, excuse me. And I get x equals 2 divided by 4 is 0.5. So here are my 2 x-intercepts for my graph. So find my x-intercepts where y equals 0. Let's see, I'm going to put those in my graph. Remember, it was 0, it was 0.5, and 1. So I'm going to make my scale show that. So I'm going to put 1 way over here, and this will be 0.5, so that I can see my graph a little bit better. So these are my 2 x-intercepts. Okay, step 2, remember, step 2 involves find your y-intercept, where x is 0. So now we put 0 in for x. Okay, so we're going to do something very similar here. We're going to plug 0 in for x. So 0 in for x, remember this one will go a lot quicker. So we're trying to find y, and we put 0 in for x. You can probably do this in your head, but I'm showing my work so I can help you understand what I'm doing in my head. 0, that's going to give me 0, minus 0 plus 2. So I'm going to get an answer of 2. So my x-intercept is at 2. So I'm going to go up 2, and I'm going to graph my x-intercept. So I have my y-intercept, not my x-intercept. We already did x-intercept. So let's take a look now at what we have. Remember the third step? The third step is to find your vertex. Okay? So our third step is going to be to find our vertex. Okay, and the key here, it's in the middle of the x-intercepts. So remember our x-intercepts were at 0.5 and 1. So we have to find the number that's in the middle of them. This is a little bit harder to do, so what I'm going to do is add the 2 values and divide by 2 to find the exact middle. And I get 0.75. That's the number that's in the middle. So remember, we take that number and we plug it into our rule. Calculate it out to get our value. We get an answer of negative 0.25. So that's going to go on my graph. 0.75 is down just below the axis. So once again, that's just barely going below. My final step is to use symmetry. Use symmetry. So remember the balance on the graph. So since this was 0.5 in I'm going to go 0.5 past the next red point, so that's to the red point here. You see here, I'm going to go another 0.5, so at 1.5, it also has to be up at 2. And that's the balance of the graph. If you're not convinced, you could plug in 1.5 for x and see that the answer for y would be 2 by using the rule. Okay, the symmetry is the hard part, so be sure to ask your teacher if you have questions on it. Okay, now it's your turn to graph your parabolas that are on your worksheet. Try to follow these steps and ask your teacher questions if you don't understand or get stuck somewhere.